20 enemy fighters, 4 trapped SEALs, 1 sniper nobody knew existed. The valley was already a kill box before the first shot cracked across the frozen air. Machine guns, RPGs. Marksmen dug into 3 ridgelines simultaneously. A perfect ambush textbook, surgical, inescapable. Except for one thing. The enemy had no idea someone was already watching them from 2 kilometers out. Had been watching for 4 days. A ghost. A shadow. A woman they never saw coming. And when the valley exploded into fire and blood, she made the only decision that mattered. She stopped watching, and she came in. If this kind of story hits different, subscribe now. Drop your city and country below so I can see exactly how far this reaches. Like if you're staying until the end. Because this one doesn't let go. The cold came first. It always did out here. Before the light, before sound, before any thought about objectives or enemy contact or the tactical weight of the day. Ahead the cold arrived like a closed fist, working through every layer she wore, finding the gaps at her wrists and the thin skin behind her ears and the exposed strip of neck between her balaclava and her collar. Northern Karelia cold, the specific kind that didn't threaten. It simply informed you that your body held no authority in this place and never would. Evelyn Mercer had been lying in the same position for 11 hours. She hadn't moved, not to eat, not to shift her weight, not to flex her fingers against the stiffness that had long since settled into her joints the way rust settles into old metal gradually, completely, without asking permission. The ghillie suit she wore was built for this terrain. White-gray, irregular, layered with frozen vegetation she'd harvested from the surrounding birch stands during her initial infiltration 3 nights ago. From the air, from a drone pass, from naked eyes, at any distance past 40 meters, she did not exist. She was snow. She was the slight variation in surface texture on a frozen hillside that the eye processed and discarded before the brain could form a question. That was the job. Her rifle sat on a low bipod, suppressed barrel, angled slightly downslope. Custom-built precision platform, 0.338 Lapua Magnum. First focal plane scope with turret adjustments. She'd pre-dialed for current conditions the night before temperature at -19 Celsius, barometric pressure dropping, wind running at 9 to 11 knots out of the northwest, with irregular gusts funneling up the valley throughout every 7 to 12 minutes. She'd been cataloging those gusts since first light, logging them in the back of her mind the way a musician memorizes a difficult passage. Not consciously, not intellectually, physically, in the tendons and the breath and the slow pulse of a body that had learned to become furniture. Through the scope, the valley below was a world rendered in cold, high-resolution detail. 4 men moved through it. SEAL Team 4, Detachment Bravo. She knew their designations, not their names. That was the protocol. Clean and deliberate, the kind of professional distance that the program had built into everything. In her field log, they were Bravo 1 through Bravo 4. Simple, nameless to her. The team lead, Bravo 1, was a tall figure who moved with the compressed authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that other people either survived or didn't. He used hand signals precisely, managed his spacing without seeming to think about it. Never bunched the team even when the terrain pressed them toward natural choke points. And this terrain was full of choke points. Frozen creek beds and iced-over boulder fields and tree lines that the valley walls funneled you toward whether you wanted to go there or not. She'd been watching Bravo 1 for 4 days, and she'd formed a judgment, the way she always formed judgments about the people she protected. He was careful, not timid, careful. The distinction mattered enormously in this work. Timid men froze at the wrong moment. Careful men survived long enough to make their training count. She'd tracked his decisions across 4 days and 3 different terrain types, and she'd noted, clinically, that he had twice slowed the team's movement when the faster option would have been easier, and the slower one was harder to justify on paper. Both times, the faster route had been wrong. She didn't know his name. She followed the protocol, but she thought, privately, in the silence of 11 hours without another human sound, that he was the kind of officer she'd have followed if the world had worked out differently for her. Day 1, the team had inserted via low-altitude parachute into a woodline 8 kilometers north of the target area, arriving at 214 hours in near-total darkness and a 15-knot crosswind that had scattered their landing slightly. She'd been in position before they hit the ground. She'd watched Bravo 1 consolidate the team in under 4 minutes, confirm status, and begin movement without wasted time. Day 2, they'd moved south into the target corridor, a region of frozen lakes and conifer forest where signals intelligence suggested an adversary logistics network was operating out of a series of buried supply caches. Day 3, deliberate reconnaissance, careful and methodical, the team photographing cache sites, pulling materials, sending encrypted burst transmissions in tight windows between satellite passes. She'd watched and overmatched and noted and said nothing. Day 4 today, they were supposed to extract. That was the plan. Plans, in her experience, were documents authored by people in buildings with central heating. The thing she noticed first was not the people. It was the snow. Specifically, it was the way snow was falling off the northern ridgeline above the valley in a pattern that didn't align with the wind direction. She'd glassed that ridge 3 times in the past 90 minutes. First pass, natural movement, wind-shifted powder rolling off the crest. Second pass, same read. Third pass, she held the scope on it longer than she intended to, longer than the first 2 times, because something nagged at the margin of her attention without presenting itself clearly enough to name. Then she identified it. The loose snow was falling from the ridge face in small, intermittent cascades. But the wind at that elevation was running northeast, which meant any natural displacement should be moving in that direction. These cascades were dropping straight down, no lateral drift. Straight down. Weight on the ridge. Recent and repeated. Boots. She went still in a way that was different from the stillness of patience. This was the stillness of a mechanism engaging. Zero guardian. Subvocal, barely above breath level, the throat mic translating the vibration rather than the sound. Encrypted burst transmission bounced to the Tactical Operations Center through 2 relays. Request immediate imagery pull, northern ridgeline, grid Kilo 7, azimuth 015. I have anomalous signature. Possible prepared position. Over. The response took 31 seconds. Guardian, 0. Imagery tasking minimum 40 minutes. Current overhead assets reallocated to priority Kitlo sector. Stand by. Over. She did not respond. She put her eye back to the scope. 40 minutes was not a number she could work with. She began working the ridge herself slowly, left to right, 1 sector at a time, the way you read text on a page, methodically, without skipping, without letting the eye jump to where it thought it wanted to go. The northern ridge sat approximately 400 meters above the valley floor at its crest and 1,700 meters from her current position. At that range, in this light, heavy overcast, flat and diffuse, killing shadows and depth cues, simultaneously, resolution was genuinely limited even with the quality of glass she was running. But she found them, not all at once. Movement first, a shift in silhouette at the edge of a tree cluster that was slightly too deliberate to be wind. Then shape a profile that was a few degrees too regular in a landscape that was composed entirely of irregular things. Then, when a narrow blade of winter light cut briefly through a gap in the cloud layer and ran down the valley wall for approximately 5 seconds, she picked up metal. A barrel. Then the blocky, functional silhouette of a crew-served weapon being repositioned by 2 people working in practice coordination. She counted, slowly, carefully. 12, 15, 17, 19. She shifted the scope east. The eastern ridgeline, lower, closer. She'd glassed it twice that morning and found nothing. She looked again with different eyes, not searching for people, but searching for the evidence of people. Disturbed snow on exposed ledges, compression patterns in the deep drifts where the wind hadn't reached, the slight regular spacing of positions that someone had selected deliberately. She found the eastern element in under a minute. 6 fighters, possibly 8. One tube that was almost certainly an RPG positioned to cover the valley floor's eastern edge. Her mind ran the geometry without being asked. The valley floor that the SEALs were approaching was a corridor roughly 300 meters wide and 800 meters long. The northern element covered the center and western edge with machine guns and anti-armor. The eastern element covered the right flank and the most obvious escape routes south. Any force entering the valley from the north, which was exactly what Bravo was doing, would walk into interlocking fields of fire with no dead ground, no covered withdrawal route, and no elevation advantage. This was not an opportunistic ambush. This had been planned, positioned, set specifically for this team, on this route, on this day, which meant there was an intelligence problem somewhere above her pay grade, and which meant the team had maybe 5 minutes before they crossed into the kill zone. 0. Guardian. Abort Bravo extraction. I have armed element. Northern Ridgeline minimum 19 personnel. Crew-served weapons and anti-armor. Secondary element Eastern Ridgeline. 6 to 8 personnel. RPG confirmed. This is a deliberate ambush for Bravo. They will enter the kill zone in approximately 5 minutes at current pace. Break. Abort extraction over. 4 seconds of silence. In tactical radio time, 4 seconds was a very long time. Guardian 0. Confirm you are calling a deliberate ambush. 2 elements, 20 plus personnel total. Confirmed. Both elements are in final position. This was pre-planned. Someone knew the route. Over. Copy, Guardian. Stand by for command decision. Over. She was already switching frequencies. Command decisions took time. Time was the one thing she didn't have. Bravo 1, Guardian Overwatch. 4 days of silence. Ended. Her voice on their frequency for the first time, and she could hear how it would land unexpected, unannounced, a voice from nowhere. You have an ambush force in prepared positions on your northern ridgeline. Minimum 19 personnel, machine guns, anti-armor. Secondary element, eastern ridgeline. You are 40 meters from the kill zone. Break south immediately and find cover. Over. Static. Then a voice low, controlled, with the texture of someone who had spent enough time in bad situations to understand that the volume of your voice was inversely proportional to the seriousness of the problem. Guardian, Bravo 1. Who am I talking to? Someone who's been watching your back for 4 days. Northern Ridgeline, final ambush positions. Break south now. Over. A half-second pause. Then all elements, Bravo 1. Halt. Break south. Find cover. Move. Through the scope, she watched the team react. Bravo 1's fist going up, the column compressing, men moving toward the eastern tree line in disciplined urgency. Good. They were going to make it to cover. They had maybe 30 seconds. The shot came from the eastern ridge. She had been watching the north. The crack was followed almost simultaneously by the flat, intimate sound of a bullet finding a human body, and Bravo 3 went down. Not a controlled drop. Not cover. The sudden, total collapse of a body whose central organization had been interrupted. He hit the frozen ground, and the momentum carried him forward half a meter, and then he was still face down. One arm extended forward in the snow like he'd been reaching for something just beyond his fingers. Then the valley detonated. The northern machine gun opened up first, a long raking burst that drew a diagonal line of impacts across the frozen ground, throwing ice chips and frozen dirt and shredded vegetation in overlapping fans. A second gun answered from the east, overlapping fires, zeroing the center of the valley floor between the two elements. The RPG came 16 seconds later, the warhead detonating 20 meters short of Bravo on N's position, with a concussion that rolled through the air and hit Evelyn in the chest from nearly 2 kilometers away. The blast pressure threw Bravo off his feet, and he scrambled on hands and knees to a boulder outcropping. That was 3 times too small for adequate cover, but was the only option within reach. Bravo 1 was behind a low rock shelf. Bravo 4 had found a frozen creek bank with a 2-foot earthen lip that was stopping rounds but wouldn't stop a second RPG hit. Bravo 3 had not moved. She was already working. First priority, the Eastern machine gun. It had better angles on the team's position than the Northern gun. Its fires were overlapping Bravo 4's cover, and the Eastern element was at significantly closer range, 940 meters, estimated, which gave it more lethality per round against the cover the team was using. She pressed her cheek to the stock. Let her breathing settle into the pattern she'd built over 6 years of this work. Not suppressed breathing, not counted breathing, just found breathing. The rhythm that arrived when she stopped, trying to manage it and let her body understand what was needed. She worked through the firing solution she'd been building for the past 2 minutes without consciously knowing she was building it. Wind 9 knots, northeast, range 940. Temperature correction for extreme cold, approximately -19, which affected both powder burn rate and projectile drag. Elevation minimal, the eastern ridge, sat approximately 60 meters above her current altitude, creating a minor upward angle, she corrected instinctively. She placed the reticle. She fired. Through the scope, she saw the machine gun position shift violently, a body falling backward, not sideways, which told her the hit was high on the torso or neck. The rate of fire from the eastern ridge dropped immediately to sporadic small arms, then stopped as the survivors reorganized. She worked the bolt. Brass ejected into the snow beside her right hand. She didn't watch it fall. Second target, the RPG position on the northern ridge. The gunner had reloaded while she was engaging east. She could see the distinctive profile change, the squat cylinder of the tube raised to the shoulder, the gunner beginning to stand into a firing position. She moved the scope, applied the northern ridge solution longer range, 1,700 meters, elevation correction for the ridge sitting 400 meters above valley floor. Wind adjustment for the different exposure at that altitude, where gusts would be running harder than in the valley. The gunner stood fully. She was already pressing the trigger. He didn't complete the motion. Bravo 1, Guardian. I have Eastern gun and Northern RPG down. Get your medic to Bravo 3. Window is narrow. Move now. Over. Guardian Bravo 1's voice was tight. We've got a gun on the north that's got the whole floor zeroed. Anyone goes for him, they die. Can you working it? Tell your medic to be ready to move on my mark. She was already repositioning. The northern machine gun was the critical threat. Now it had a beaten zone that covered the open ground between the team's cover positions and where Bravo 3 lay in the snow, which meant the medic couldn't reach him, which meant the tourniquet that wasn't on his leg yet was the thing that was going to kill him if she didn't solve this in the next 2 or 3 minutes. She moved 15 meters north and upslope, trading concealment for a better sight line to the northern ridge's gun position. She found new cover behind a dense birch cluster and settled fast, no time for a careful hide, just stable and still and eyes on the target. The northern gun team was operating from a prepared fighting position. She could see it clearly now, a scrape in the ridge face reinforced with cut timber and packed snow, well built, probably 2 days of work. The gun was an older medium machine gun, 7.62, operated by 2 men, 1 feeding and 1 firing. She picked the shooter first doctrine, removed the trigger finger, forced the secondary into a roll transition that cost seconds. She placed the reticle, held for a wind gust that she timed to the edge of its cycle, and fired. The gun went silent. Bravo 4, move. Move now. She watched through the scope as the medic came up from the creek bank and sprinted across the open ground toward Bravo 3, 20 meters, 30, and went to his knees beside the casualty and began working. She covered the ridge above. scanning for any gun team that might try to reacquire. 0 Guardian. Northern gun suppressed. I have 1 urgent surgical in progress. QRF status over. Guardian 0. QRF is 48 minutes from your grid. Weather system moving in from West Rotary assets will be delayed pending window assessment. Over. 48 minutes. She watched Bravo 4's hands moving fast and deliberate over Bravo 3's leg. She watched the team's ammunition expenditure, Bravo 1 and Bravo 2 Woe, firing in controlled pairs, conserving rounds, buying time without burning the supply. She counted the fighters she could still identify on the ridgelines and arrived at a number that was too high. 12 remaining, possibly 14. Reorganizing, pulling back from exposed positions, redistributing into a tighter formation that would be harder to engage from distance and more lethal if they advanced. They were going to advance. She knew it the way she knew weather coming, not from data, from the texture of things. The enemy had lost their RPG and 1 machine gun team and taken casualties, but they still held the numbers and the elevation and the initiative. In another 10 minutes, they would push forward to closer range positions, and the team's cover wouldn't be adequate, and the ammunition wouldn't last. 48 minutes was not a plan. It was a death sentence with extra steps. She ran the numbers without sentimentality, the way she'd been trained to run numbers as problems with solutions, not as situations with feelings. The team could not extract with a casualty who couldn't move, and an enemy force of 12 plus pressing their position. The overwatch fires she could bring from her current position would slow the enemy advance, but not stop it, eventually. They would find angles she couldn't cover, move into dead ground, close the range enough that the precision advantage of her platform became irrelevant, unless someone hit them from a direction they weren't watching. She looked at the ridgeline behind the enemy formation. The northern ridge's rear approached the slope that faced away from the valley, that none of the enemy's security was oriented toward because nobody who mattered to them was coming from that direction. Nobody except her. She picked up her radio. 0 Guardian. I am breaking Overwatch and moving to close action on enemy rear element. Do not adjust fires or KAS in my direction. I will be inside the formation. Acknowledge and pass to all elements. Over. A pause that went 3 seconds longer than it should have. Guardian, 0. That is significantly outside your mission parameters. Your sanctioned role is, I understand what my role is. A beat. Queter. Not angry. Just clear. And I understand what Bravo 3's femoral bleed looks like in 48 minutes. I'm going in. Guardian out. She didn't wait. She broke down the hide with practiced speed, scattered the brass, collapsed the bipod. Nothing left that told a story she didn't want told, and slung the sniper rifle diagonally across her back. The long rifle would be useless at close range. She unslung the carbine from her chest rig. Compact suppressed, 5.56, built for speed and decision-making rather than precision and patience. She checked the magazine full. 30 rounds, confirmed the suppressor was torqued correctly. Rotated the selector to fire. Bravo 1's voice came through the earpiece. Guardian, wait, what are you? Keep your heads down, she said. Fire when you have clear targets. Don't stop firing. She stepped out of her hide, and she ran. The terrain between her position and the enemy's rear was 2 kilometers of broken ridge, frozen creek crossings, and birch forest, with snow waist-deep in the hollows and shin-deep on the exposed faces where the wind had packed it hard. She ran it the way she'd been trained to run bad terrain in full kit, not sprinting, not jogging, but a controlled forward aggression that used the landscape instead of fighting it. She cut along ridge spines to stay below skylines. She used the tree lines where the canopy had protected the ground from the deepest accumulation. She crossed the open faces, fast and low, never pausing in exposed ground, moving from one piece of cover to the next with the automatic economy of someone who had trained this until training became reflex. Her shoulder was aching now the fragment strike from the earlier RPG detonation, something she'd cataloged and set aside. Range of motion was intact. Pain was information, not instruction. She filed it and kept moving. Behind her, below, the firefight continued in the irregular rhythm of controlled teams, the SEALs burning their ammunition carefully, firing only when they had target definition, which was rarely. The enemy was tightening the circle. She could hear it in how the angles of the reports were changing. Closer, more convergent. She ran harder. The storm arrived before she reached the ridge. Not gradually. The weather in this part of Karelia didn't negotiate it, moved in system-wide, a wall of pressure and wind and horizontally driven snow that reduced visibility from kilometers to meters in under 5 minutes. The temperature psychologically, professionally, the temperature dropped another 4 degrees in the first 60 seconds of the front's arrival, and the wind went from manageable to something that required physical effort to move against. She pulled her balaclava tighter and kept going. The ridge crest was ice-covered under a deceptive layer of loose snow, and she went to a knee twice on the ascent before she adjusted her footing angle and found traction. She came over the top at a crouch, immediately dropping flat on the far side, and brought up her carbine. The rear of the enemy formation was 30 meters below her. 6 fighters in a loose security cluster, positioned facing the valley, watching the firefight below them with the settled attention of men who believed in the completeness of their planning. They were talking to each other in low voices. One of them was eating something. She could see the motion of his arm, the particular movement of a person bringing food to their mouth, the mundane human gesture in the middle of something that was anything but mundane. None of them were facing upslope. None of them were watching the ridge behind them. She pressed herself behind a collapsed birch and took 3 slow breaths. 6 years. 6 years of this work. 6 years of distances measured in hundreds of meters, of kills that felt like mathematics, of a program built entirely around the principle of invisibility. She had never been in a room with the people she'd protected. She had never closed to a distance where the sound of a suppressed shot would be identifiable as a shh by anyone nearby. She had never done what she was about to do. The recognition of that moved through her cleanly, without sentiment. She wasn't afraid. She was precise about what was happening, and what it was going to cost, and what it was going to change, and she was at peace with the arithmetic. Bravo 3 was bleeding out in the snow below. She checked her sight, confirmed her position. Evelyn Mercer took one more breath, the cold air hitting the back of her throat like a blade. And she stepped out of the shadows for the first time in 6 years. The first fighter died without knowing she was there. She came down the slope at an angle that kept the birch trunks between her and the security cluster, moving heel to toe in the packed snow, each footfall placed with the deliberate care of someone who understood that sound traveled differently in frozen air, farther, cleaner, with less ambient noise to absorb it. The wind was working in her favor now, the storm front pushing a sustained roar across the ridgeline that buried the small sounds of her movement. She closed to 12 meters before the nearest fighter's posture changed a slight shift of the shoulders, the instinctive physical signal of a body that had registered something wrong before the mind caught up. She didn't give him time to turn around. 2 shots, suppressed, the carbine's report swallowed by the wind. The fighter went forward into the snow without a sound. The second man, 3 meters to his left, started to turn at the peripheral motion, and she was already moving the muzzle, already pressing, and he dropped before the turn completed. 4 left in the cluster. The next 2 seconds were the most dangerous. 4 men, close range, and she was no longer invisible. She was a shape moving through their rear security position, and the human eye catches movement, even when the mind hasn't identified the threat yet. She moved hard left, putting a boulder between herself and the remaining 4, and heard one of them say something sharp and questioning in a language she recognized as a regional dialect, not a warning yet. Just a question. What was that directed at the space where his 2 companions had just been? She didn't let it become a warning. She came around the left side of the boulder, low and fast, and the fighter nearest her had his weapon halfway to his shoulder when she shot him twice in his chest and once in the neck as he was falling. And then she was moving again before he hit the ground, using his falling body as a distraction for the man beside him, who tracked the wrong thing for the half second she needed. The fifth man went down. The sixth was smarter. He'd broken away from the cluster when the first shots were fired, not toward the valley, not up the slope, but sideways along the ridgeline, putting distance between himself and whatever was killing his team. She tracked him at 40 meters through a gap in the birches, running hard, and she led the shot by a fraction and fired once. He went down. Got back up, she'd hit him in the upper back, not a clean stop. He was moving slower. She closed the distance at a run, covered the 40 meters in terrain that punished her for every meter of it, and came around a fallen tree to find him on his knees with his sidearm out. He fired twice. Both rounds went wide right, which told her the hit had affected his shoulder or arm. She shot him once more, and he stayed down. 7 seconds. 6 fighters. She pressed her back against the fallen tree and held completely still, breathing through her nose, counting. Her heart was moving fast, not the trained stillness of Overwatch work, but the full-body electrical engagement of close combat, the kind of physiological response that training managed but never eliminated. She waited 5 seconds for anyone else who might have been further out in the security perimeter. Nothing. She keyed her radio. Bravo 1, Guardian. Rear security element neutralized. 6 personnel. I'm moving to your northern flank. Keep firing, I need them looking at you over. A pause that was 1 second too long. Guardian. Bravo 1's voice had changed. Something had shifted in the texture of it, not softer, but recalibrated, the way a person's voice changes when they've just had to update their understanding of a situation significantly. Copy. We're low on ammunition. Bravo 3 is stabilized. Tourniquet is on, bleeding controlled. But we need to move him, and we can't move him under this fire. Over, I know. Give me 4 minutes. She was already moving along the ridge toward the northern machine gun element's flank. The storm was intensifying. The horizontal intense snow reduced her visibility to 30 meters in any direction, which was both a problem and an advantage. It was reducing the enemy's visibility by the same measure. And in close terrain, a sniper who could no longer work at distance defaulted to the same rules as everyone else. She was no longer fighting at her best range. Neither were they. That equalized things in a way she could work with. The northern machine gun she'd put down the crew, but she'd also heard it restart during her movement through the rear security position. They'd moved a secondary crew up to the gun. She could hear it now, the distinctive rhythmic 7.62 rounds, steady and methodical, working the valley floor below in long, searching bursts. Whoever was running it now knew what they were doing. She came up on the position from the northwest, using the ridgeline itself as cover, belly crawling the last 20 meters through snow that was deep enough to pull at her arms with every forward movement. The cold was no longer background information. It was active, aggressive, working at her core temperature through every second she spent stationary in the snow. She felt it in her hands first. The fingers of her right hand were adequate. She'd kept them moving during the approach. The left hand, the support hand, was stiffer than she wanted. She flexed the left hand 3 times around the carbine's foregrip. It would do. The machine gun position resolved out of the storm at 25 meters, a timber-reinforced scrape in the ridge face. 2 men, the gunner prone behind the weapon, and a loader kneeling to his right with a fresh belt half-fed through the receiver. They were concentrating entirely on the valley below, tracking their fires, adjusting. Neither of them was looking at the ridgeline behind them. She shot the loader first this time. The gunner was the trigger finger, Doctrine said, but Doctrine also said adapt when the situation demanded it, and the situation demanded that she not have a functioning belt-fed weapon after the next 3 seconds. The loader went down, the belt pulling loose from the receiver as he fell. The gunner reacted fast enough that she had to fire twice before he stopped moving, and the second shot was messier than she preferred, close enough that she felt the brass eject past her cheek. Silence from the gun position. She moved up and disabled the weapon, pulling the bolt carrier group and throwing it down the ridgeline slope, which was faster and more reliable than trying to damage the barrel in the time she had. Then she kept moving. Her radio crackled. Guardian, Bravo 1. Northern gun went quiet again. What is your status? Over. Moving to Eastern Element. How are your rounds? Bravo 1 is down to 4 magazines. Bravo TWO has 3. Bravo 4 expended most on the initial contact. He's basically a medic right now. 4 magazines plus 3. At 30 rounds, each in a sustained firefight, that was somewhere between 4 and 8 minutes of fighting, depending on tempo. She had the enemy rear element neutralized and 1 gun position cleared. But she'd counted 12 to 14 fighters still active when she began the approach, and she'd counted for 8 so far, which meant there were still 4 to 6 fighters somewhere on the ridgelines with functional weapons, and by now, a very clear understanding that something was wrong with their rear. The question was whether they'd figured out what. She got her answer 40 seconds later. The shot came from above, and to her right a single round that clipped the top of a birch trunk 6 inches from her head and showered her with frozen bark. She dropped and rolled left into a depression in the snow, not thinking about it, the body executing the response before the mind finished processing the threat. She came up in a crouch with the carbine forward and scanned the slope above. A sniper's. They had their own precision shooter, and he'd found her. That's news, she said, to nobody. She moved immediately. Staying still after being located was the fastest way to die in this situation, and she'd been located. She broke right, using a boulder cluster for cover, covering 10 meters in a low sprint before the second shot came in. It hit the snow a meter behind her left foot. He was tracking well, leading her correctly. Skilled shooter. She went to ground behind the largest boulder and pressed herself flat. The situation had changed. She'd been the hunter for the last 8 minutes. She was now simultaneously the hunted. She ran the assessment fast and without emotion. Enemy sniper, elevated position, upper northwestern ridgeline. Based on the shot angles, he had height advantage and likely a longer range platform than her carbine. Her sniper rifle was slung across her back and would take 15 seconds to unsling, mount, and come to a shooting position, during which she would need to be exposed. Not viable. Her carbine was accurate to maybe 250 meters in calm conditions, and conditions were not calm. She was in a storm, on a ridgeline, with a precision shooter above her who had the angle. She needed to either close the distance or break contact. Her radio. Bravo 1 Guardian. I have a sniper on my position, northwest ridge, elevated. I need a distraction. Can you put fire on the northwest ridge line on my mark? Even if you can't see targets. Suppressive fire, northwest, 60 seconds. Over. Guardian, we are very low on 60 seconds. Everything you can put in that direction. On my mark. A breath. Mark. The valley below erupted. Even through the storm, she could hear the sustained crack of the SEALs' weapons going cyclic, not the controlled, deliberate fire they'd been using to conserve ammunition, but full suppression. Everything they had, hammering the northwestern ridgeline for 60 seconds. It was the sound of men spending their last reserves because someone they couldn't see had asked them to trust her. She was already moving. She left the boulder at a sprint, cutting hard right and upslope, angling toward the northwestern ridge from below and to the east, away from the angle the enemy sniper would expect and coming at his position from the side rather than from below. She burned the 60 seconds of suppressive fire to cover 200 meters of terrain at a run. And when the firing from the valley stopped, she was already in the birch stand below the northwestern ridge's shoulder, chest heaving, legs burning from the deep snow. She stopped, listened, wind, the creak of frozen wood. The distant, intermittent crack of small arms from somewhere on the eastern ridge. 2 fighters, she estimated, firing at the valley below, not at her. She began climbing the northwestern shoulder. Stekt. The enemy sniper found her again at 70 meters, a shot that cut through the air close enough that she heard the displacement, the specific crack thump that meant a round had passed near her head rather than near her body. And she dropped and scrambled behind a snow-covered rock formation and lay completely still. He was good. He was tracking her movement pattern and anticipating. She needed to stop being predictable. She waited. 30 seconds. 45. The storm hammered the ridge, and the temperature was genuinely dangerous. Now she could feel the cold working deeper, past the adrenaline buffer, into the muscle tissue. She needed to move. Staying still in these temperatures for any extended period was a death of a different kind. But she waited. 60 seconds. Then she moved, not in the direction she'd been traveling, not the obvious continuation of her previous angle, but directly uphill, straight up the slope, the hardest physical direction, and therefore the least expected tactical one. She climbed on hands and knees where the slope was steepest, using the snow as cover instead of fighting it, pulling herself up through a dense stand of birch that would make a clean shot almost impossible at close range. The sniper didn't fire. She came over the ridge shoulder and found herself on the upper plateau, an exposed, wind-scored surface, maybe 40 meters wide, the snow here packed hard and low by the constant wind. She was above the sniper's expected position. She went flat and crawled forward on elbows, scanning. She found him in 30 seconds. He was in a good position, a natural rock shelf on the ridge's south face, giving him a clean line of sight down into the valley and across the ridgeline she'd been moving through. He was scanning now, looking for her, the scope moving in a slow, methodical sweep. He hadn't seen her come over the top. She was 35 meters above and behind him. The carbine would handle 35 meters without difficulty. She settled the sight, controlled her breathing, placed the reticle, and fired twice. The scope stopped moving. She held her position for 10 seconds, watching for any secondary reaction from other positions. Nothing. She keyed the radio. Bravo 1, Guardian. Sniper element neutralized. Eastern Ridge still has 2 active. Status on Bravo 3 over. Bravo 1's voice came back clipped and tight. Stable, but we need to move him. He's losing core temp on the ground. If we don't get him somewhere out of this storm in the next. A pause. She could hear something in the background wind, yes, but also a change in the quality of the radio signal, the atmospheric distortion that came with a major weather system pressing down hard. Guardian, the storm is getting bad. I mean really bad. I can barely see Bravo 2-0 from my position right now. Over. She looked up from the ridge. The valley had disappeared. That was the only accurate description for it. The storm front had moved through completely now, and what had been reduced visibility had become something categorically different, a whiteout, genuine and total, the kind of winter condition where the ground and the sky became the same color and texture, and the horizon ceased to exist as a concept. She couldn't see the valley floor. She couldn't see the eastern ridge. She could see approximately 20 meters in any direction, and the edges of that 20 meters were not clear. They were dissolving gradients of white that could be anything. The remaining 2 fighters on the eastern ridge were still out there, somewhere. In this visibility, finding them was going to be extremely difficult. But in this visibility, them finding the SEALs was going to be equally difficult. That was the only good news. She made a decision. Bravo 1, Guardian. The storm is shutting down the engagement. Eastern element is still active, but they've lost visibility, same as us. Start moving Bravo 3, north-northwest, toward the ridge. I'm going to guide you to a shelter position. Over. Guardian, we are not going north. North is where they won't look for you in a whiteout. She kept her voice level. And north is where I know a cave system that will keep Bravo 3 alive until QRF can get through. South is open terrain with no cover and 2 active shooters who know that route. Over. A pause. She could feel the weight of Bravo 1's decision from across the ridgeline. Guardian. His voice had a different quality now. Not soft Bravo 1. Didn't seem like a man who did soft. But there was something there that hadn't been there before. A careful attentiveness. Like a person listening to a voice they'd initially dismissed and now weren't sure they'd read correctly. We don't know who you are. We don't know what unit you're from. We don't know anything about you except that you've been apparently following us for 4 days and you just cleared a ridgeline by yourself. And now you want us to follow you north into a whiteout. Yes, that's a lot of trust to ask for. Bravo 3's tourniquet has been on for approximately 22 minutes, she said. How long before that becomes a different problem? Silence. The wind filled it. Bravo 1 copies. We're moving. Guide us in. Over. She came down off the northwestern ridge in the whiteout, using the terrain features she'd memorized over 4 days of watching this valley, not landmarks, which had all disappeared into the white, but topography. The angle of slopes, the spacing of tree stands, the way the frozen creek beds ran. She navigated by feel and memory and the compass on her wrist, and she moved toward where the SEAL team should be, and trusted that the coordinates in her head were accurate. She found them 12 minutes later, which was longer than she'd have liked, the storm making every meter of movement a negotiation with the terrain. Bravo 4 was supporting Bravo 3, one of the wounded man's arms across the medic's shoulders, his injured leg wrapped in an improvised splint that was doing its job. Bravo 2 was on their left flank. Bravo 1 was rear security, moving backward, watching the white nothing behind them with his rifle up. He turned when she materialized out of the storm. For a moment, neither of them said anything. She was aware, in a way she rarely was, of what she must look like ghillie suit torn where it had snagged during the approach, snow-covered, carbine in her hands, a rifle slung across her back that was built for a different kind of work than anyone expected in a situation like this. She was 5'8", lean from the kind of fieldwork that stripped everything unnecessary from the body, and she knew not what any of them had pictured when they heard the word Overwatch. Bravo 1 looked at her for one long second. She watched him do the math, the 2 rifles, the positioning, the equipment, loadout, the specifics of what she'd done on that ridgeline. You've been out here 4 days, he said. Yes. Alone. That's the job. He looked at her for another second. Then he turned to his team. Move out. Stay on her. She led them north. The going was brutal in a way that the earlier fighting hadn't been, because fighting ran on adrenaline and movement, and this was just hard physical work in terrible conditions. The snow was waist-deep in the hollows, and Bravo 3 couldn't use his left leg, which meant Bravo 4 was essentially carrying half his body weight in addition to his own kit, which meant their pace was slow, which meant longer exposure to the temperature, which was now sitting at what she estimated was -23 and dropping. Bet? She set the pace deliberately fast enough to maintain core temperature, slow enough that Bravo 4 didn't drop the casualty. She watched the terrain constantly, her carbine up, scanning the white on every side. The 2 remaining fighters on the eastern ridge were somewhere in this storm. She didn't know if they were pursuing or sheltering. She couldn't take either assumption. Woe came up beside her at one point, matching her pace, and she could feel him looking at her the way people sometimes looked at things they were trying to categorize. You're not JSOC, he said. Not a question. No. Special activities. No. A pause. What then? Something smaller. He processed that. How many of you are there? She glanced at him. Enough. He let it go. Smart man. Bravo 1 pulled up beside her from the rear 20 minutes into the movement. The cave system she was targeting was still almost a mile north, and Bravo 3's breathing had changed. She could hear it. The specific altered quality of someone fighting hypothermia on top of blood loss, the body beginning to prioritize core survival over peripheral function. He's getting worse, Bravo 1 said quietly. Not a panic. An assessment. I know. 40 minutes. He doesn't have 40 minutes the way we're moving. Then we move faster. She shifted Bravo 3's other arm across her own shoulders without taking weight off Bravo 4, and she felt the man's breath on her cheek, ragged, shallow, too fast. Come on, lean on me. We're not stopping. Bravo 3's head turned slightly toward her. Through the balaclava and the snow and the fog of blood loss and cold, she couldn't tell if he was fully conscious. But his hand gripped her shoulder, tightened. She kept walking. Bravo 1 dropped back to rear security without another word. The cave system appeared out of the whiteout as a darkness in the rock faced a low, horizontal opening in a granite outcropping that she'd noted on her initial reconnaissance infiltration, filed away as a contingency and never imagined actually using. She got them inside in groups Bravo 4 and Bravo 3 first, then Bravo 1, then herself last after she'd spent 60 seconds standing in the entrance, listening to the storm for the sound of pursuit inside it. Nothing. She stepped inside. The cave ran back maybe 15 meters, widening into a natural chamber, large enough for 5 people to sit without touching. Not warm nowhere in this part of the world was warm, right now, but out of the wind, which changed the thermal equation significantly. She could feel the difference immediately. The violent edge of the cold blunted to something merely subsistent. Bravo 4 already had Bravo 3 flat on an emergency blanket, working through a casualty reassessment with the focused efficiency of someone running a drill they'd run 1,000 times. She watched his hands for a moment, checking the tourniquet, reassessing the wound, adjusting. Good hands. Good medic. Bravo 1 sat against the cave wall, opposite her, rifle across his knees, looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not hostile, not grateful. Something more complicated than either. You broke your mission parameters to come in, he said. Yes. Your command is going to have something to say about that. Probably. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm hammered the rock face, the sound of it filling the cave like water, filling a vessel. Bravo 2 was on the entrance, watching the white nothing beyond. Bravo 4 was talking quietly to Bravo 3, the low, steady voice of a medic keeping a patient conscious and oriented. What's your name? Bravo 1 asked. She met his eyes. Guardian. He accepted that. How long were you actually out there before we inserted? I was in position before your feet hit the ground. Something moved across his face, not quite discomfort, not quite admiration. The expression of someone recalculating a situation they thought they'd understood. 4 days. Same position? I moved twice for better angles. Otherwise, yes. In -20. The gear handles it. The gear. He said it in a tone that suggested he understood it wasn't just the gear. Then that ridge. You cleared a security element and 2 gun positions and a sniper. By yourself. In a storm. She didn't answer her. It wasn't a question. I've been doing this for 11 years, he said. I've worked with Rangers, Delta, MARSOC, every flavor of special operations you can name. I have never... He stopped, started again differently. Nobody briefed us on a Guardian asset. Nobody told us we had Overwatch. We've been moving for 4 days, thinking we were alone out here. That's the point, she said. If you know we're there, you change how you move. If you change how you move, it's harder to protect you. He absorbed that slowly. And if something goes wrong? She looked at him steadily. Something went wrong. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, without any particular ceremony, he extended his hand. Dawson, he said. Cole Dawson. She looked at his hand. The protocol was clear. The protocol had also been written by people in warm buildings who had never spent 4 days on a frozen ridgeline, watching 4 men who didn't know they were being watched. She shook it. Mercer. He nodded once. No follow-up. No further questions about her unit, her rank, her chain of command. He seemed to understand in the way that experienced operators understood things, that some answers existed in categories he wasn't cleared for, and pushing on them served no purpose. Bravo 4 looked up from Bravo 3. He's stable. Tourniquet's doing its job. Core temp is a concern, but getting him out of the wind helps. He needs surgical in the next 2-3 hours, but he's not going to die in the next 30 minutes. He paused. Probably. QRF is on hold for the weather window, Evelyn said. When the storm breaks, they'll have rotary assets ready. We wait. And the 2 remaining fighters on the East Ridge? Bravo 1, Dawson asked. In this visibility, they can't find us. When the storm breaks, I'll go back out and locate them before we move to the extraction point. He looked at her steadily. You'll go back out. Yes. After clearing 2 gun positions, a sniper, and a security element carrying a casualty through a whiteout. The job isn't finished. He studied her for a moment. Something in his face, the calculation behind it. The professional assessment that had been running since she'd materialized out of the storm settled into a different configuration. Not resolution, exactly. More like the acknowledgement that some questions weren't going to be answered tonight, and that was going to have to be acceptable. Get some rest, he said finally. I'll take first watch. She almost told him she didn't need rest. That would have been a lie. Her shoulder was genuinely hurting now. The adrenaline fully metabolized, the fragment strike presenting itself clearly as something that needed attention. Her core temperature had dropped further than she preferred during the movement. Her hands were stiff in ways that mattered for precision work. She checked the cave entrance, checked her radio, sent a brief burst transmission to 0 position, status, personnel, weather hold. Then she sat against the cave wall, carbine across her lap, and closed her eyes. Outside, the storm did not relent. Inside the cave, Bravo 3's breathing steadied into something more regular, less labored. Bravo 4 sat beside him, and monitored with the patience of someone who understood that presence was sometimes the most important medical intervention available. What held the entrance? Dawson sat where he'd been sitting, watching the darkness of the cave interior, with the contained alertness of a man who'd learned to stay switched on even when his body wanted something different. None of them spoke. The storm was the only voice, and it said nothing that required an answer. Exasimans. Evelyn sat in the cold and the dark and thought about the 2 fighters still out there on the eastern ridge, and the extraction window, and the shoulder she was going to have to inventory properly before she went back out, and the transmission her command was going to send her when the weather cleared. She thought about all of those things. And then she stopped thinking and let her body do what it needed, which was the closest thing to rest that her work allowed. She came back from the edge of sleep the way she always did, not gradually, not with the slow surfacing of normal rest, but all at once, a clean transition from dark to alert, with no soft middle ground. 6 years of fieldwork had burned away her ability to wake slowly. Her body had learned that the gap between sleep and awareness was where people died. The cave was dim. The storm outside had changed pitch, lower now, less violent, the howling reduced to a sustained moan that pressed against the rock face without the earlier ferocity. She checked her watch. 2 hours and 17 minutes. Bravo, what was at the entrance? Different posture than before. The particular stillness of someone, fighting to stay sharp on a watch they'd been holding too long. Bravo 4 was asleep against the cave wall, one hand still resting on Bravo 3's arm, even in some sleep, the unconscious monitoring of a medic who couldn't fully switch off. Bravo 3 was breathing steadily. Color in his face was better than she'd expected. Dawson was exactly where she'd left him, back against the cave wall, rifle across his knees, eyes open. She wasn't sure he'd slept at all. He looked at her when she moved. Storm's breaking. I know. She'd heard it in the change of pitch. How long? Started thinning maybe 40 minutes ago. Still bad, but you can see 60-70 meters now. Getting better. She did the math. If the storm broke fully within the next hour, QRF rotary assets could potentially launch from their staging area and reach this grid in approximately another 40 to 50 minutes after that. Call it 90 minutes to extraction. 90 minutes with 2 active fighters somewhere on the eastern ridge. 2 live men who knew this area and had weapons, and were very probably not sitting quietly in the storm, waiting to be found. She started checking her kit. Carbine first breech, bolt, magazine. She had 1 full magazine remaining from her original load, plus a partial she'd consolidated from the 2 she'd burned on the ridgeline. 51 rounds total. The sniper rifle was still fully loaded. She hadn't fired it since the opening engagement because close terrain and storm conditions had made it the wrong tool for everything that came after. Her shoulder had stiffened completely during the rest period. She worked her left arm through a slow rotation, feeling the grinding resistance in the joint. The fragment had done something to the tissue that wasn't catastrophic, but wasn't comfortable. And the cold had contracted everything around the injury in a way that made the range of motion genuinely limited. She could manage it. She'd have to. "You're hurt," Dawson said. "I'm functional." "That's not what I said." She looked at him. He was watching her arm rotation with the assessing gaze of someone who'd ensign enough injury to know the difference between hurt and compromised. "Fragment from the RPG on the ridge," she said. "During the approach. It's manageable. Bravo 4 should look at it. After. Before would be better. After," she said again, and the flatness in her voice closed the subject in a way that Dawson seemed to recognize, because he didn't push it. She moved to the cave entrance. Bravo was shifted aside without being asked, giving her the position, and she looked out at the storm. He was right, visibility had improved. 60 meters, maybe 75 at the clearer intervals between gusts. The eastern ridgeline was still invisible, buried in cloud and driven snow, but the valley floor had begun to emerge in gray outlines. Shapes returning to the world. Her radio crackled. She stepped back from the entrance and pressed the earpiece. Guardian, 0. The signal was better now. The storm's interference reduced. Weather window assessment, partial break, current minus 40 minutes. Rotary QRF can launch on your confirmation. What is your situation? Over. 0 Guardian. I have 4 personnel, 1 urgent surgical, currently sheltered. Grid follows. She read off the cave coordinates from her GPS. I have 2 confirmed active enemy personnel, last known eastern ridgeline. Before QRF approach, I need to locate and neutralize those 2. I cannot have active shooters on approach routes when birds come in. Over. Guardian, copy. Can your current friendly element provide support? Over. She glanced at Dawson. At Bravo 4, asleep against the wall. At Bravo 3's leg. Negative. Element has a litter casualty and is low on ammunition. I'll handle it. QRF standby for my all clear. Over. Guardian 0. Confirmed. QRF will hold for your signal. Over. She clicked off and turned to find Dawson standing directly behind her. He'd moved without her hearing it, which was either a comment on his fieldcraft or on how tired she actually was. "You're going back out," he said. "Yes. 2 shooters. Eastern Ridge. Your carbine is almost empty and your shoulder is compromised. Accurate. And you're going alone." "I've been alone for 4 days," she said. "This is a shorter problem." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she was beginning to learn, the one where he was running the argument in his head, arriving at the conclusion that the argument was going to lose, and choosing not to waste time on it. Take Bravo 2. He's got ammunition and he's fresh enough. He stays here. If those 2 fighters find this cave while I'm gone, you need everyone you have. Then take me. She blinked. It was the first thing he'd said in 2 hours that she hadn't anticipated. "You're the team leader. You don't. I have 3 magazines and a functioning trigger finger, and I know how to move quietly. You go out there alone with 50 rounds and a bad shoulder, and you don't come back. My team sits in this cave until QRF arrives, and those fighters have all the time they need." He held her gaze. 2 is better than 1. Even you have to know that. She did know that. That was the problem with people who were right. "You follow my direction. she said. You don't engage unless I initiate or unless we're in immediate contact. You do not fire at anything you can't positively identify. Over. You just gave me a SEAL briefing. I just gave you my rules. Yes or no? Yes. She looked at him for one more second. Then she nodded. Wake your medic. He has the watch. We move in 3 minutes. She was back at the entrance in 2, doing a final check, when Bravo 4 appeared at her shoulder. He was fully awake, the transition from sleep to alert, almost as fast as her own, and he had a look on his face that she recognized the expression of someone who had something to say and wasn't sure how it would land. Hey, his voice was quiet. 3 is alive because of you. I want you to know I understand that. She didn't respond immediately. In her experience, gratitude in the field was a weight that didn't help you move faster. But there was something in his voice that wasn't just gratitude, it was the specific acknowledgement of one professional to another, offered without expectation of anything in return. Keep his temperature up, she said, and keep the tourniquet where it is until you have surgical capability. Don't remove it in the field, regardless of how the wound looks. He nodded. I know you know. She looked at him for a moment. He's going to be fine. Bravo 4 said nothing, but something in his posture changed. A small release, a breath he'd been holding without knowing it. She turned back to the entrance. Dawson was beside her, weapons checked, ready. She moved out into the storm. The cold hit differently. After 2 hours in shelter, more aggressive, more personal, the body having partially recovered its baseline temperature and now being asked to surrender it again. She pushed the sensation to the margin of her awareness and focused on the terrain. The visibility was better than it had been at the worst of the storm, but still fundamentally challenging 50 to 80 meters, depending on the gust cycle, with the intervals of better visibility lasting only a few seconds before the driven snow closed back in. She moved east along the base of the northern ridge, keeping low, using the rock face above her for cover against observation from the eastern ridgeline. Dawson moved behind her at 4 meters distance, close enough to maintain visual contact in the poor visibility, far enough that a single burst of fire wouldn't catch them both. She'd told him 4 meters, and he'd maintained it exactly, which told her something about his discipline. She stopped at the corner of the northern ridge where it curved south toward the valley and pressed herself flat against the rock. Dawson came up beside her, and she pointed east, the invisible eastern ridgeline, somewhere in the white, and held up 2 fingers. He nodded. The question was where the 2 fighters were. During the main engagement, they'd been on the eastern ridge proper. But the storm would have driven them off any exposed position survival instinct, basic field sense. They would have sought shelter. The question was what shelter was available on the eastern ridge, which she'd studied during her 4-day overwatch, but had never physically reconnoitered. She pulled her mental map of the area. The eastern ridge ran roughly north-south, lower than the northern ridge, with a mixed terrain of rock faces and birch forest on its western slope. During her overwatch, she'd noted 2 features that could function as shelter: a rock formation near the ridge's midpoint that created a natural windbreak, and a tree cluster near the southern end of the ridge that was dense enough to provide some protection from the horizontal snow. The rock formation was closer to the original ambush positions. If the fighters were disciplined and trained, they'd stayed near their last known position, maintained their orientation, waited for the storm to break. If they were cold and scared and operating on survival instinct rather than tactics, they'd gone for the tree cluster because it looked like more cover, even though tactically it was a worse position. She couldn't know which. She had to check both. She signaled Dawson move and stepped out from the rock face into the open terrain of the valley's eastern margin. The crossing was exposed, and she hated every meter of it. 60 meters of ground with no cover, the eastern ridgeline, somewhere ahead in the white, and 2 men with weapons who were very motivated to still be alive at the end of this day. She moved fast and low, not sprintings, Sprinting in deep snow was a fantasy, but pushing her pace to the edge of what the terrain allowed, and Dawson matched her without instruction. They reached the tree line at the base of the eastern ridge and stopped. No shots, no reaction. She looked at Dawson and pointed up the ridge. Then pointed at herself and made a circling motion. She was going to the rock formation first. Then pointed at him and pointed at the ground. He stayed here, covered the base, watched for anyone moving down off the ridge toward them. He held up a hand. "I go with you. That's what we agreed." "I need eyes on the base," she said. Quiet, barely above breath. "Then I'm a liability up there if I'm thinking about the base." She looked at him. The argument had a point, and she was too tired and too short on time to find the better counter to it. "Fine. Stay 2 meters. If we take contact, break left, there's a rock formation about 30 meters upslope, good cover." "How do you know that?" "I spent 4 days looking at this ridge." He didn't have an answer for that. She turned and started climbing. The eastern ridge's western slope was steep in the lower section, manageable in the middle, and she climbed it through birch forest that gave intermittent cover. The snow was shallower here, the steepness preventing accumulation on the slope face, which made movement easier but also made sound management harder, frozen ground under thin snow instead of the muffling depth of the valley floor. She moved slowly. 10 meters, stop, listen. Then 10 more. The rock formation appeared out of the white at 25 meters, and she found it empty. No sign of recent occupation, no boot impressions in the snow beside it, no food wrappers, no evidence of a body's heat in the compressed snow. Either they hadn't come here, or they'd cleared out hours ago. She looked at Dawson. He was reading the same thing. She pointed south the tree cluster. They moved along the ridge, face south trending, staying just below the crest line, so the ridge line itself provided cover against observation from above. The wind up here was harder than in the valley, concentrated by the ridge's shape, channeled and accelerated, cutting through the layers in a way that made sustained movement genuinely dangerous for core temperature. She heard them before she saw them. Not voices, she was too far for voices in this wind, but sound carried oddly in storm conditions, the wind creating pockets of relative quiet between the gusts, and in one of those pockets she heard something metallic. A weapon being adjusted, or equipment shifting against equipment. Something that wasn't the storm. She stopped immediately. Dawson stopped with her, not touching her, not asking, just stopped because she'd stopped, and that was enough. She listened through the next gust, and the one after. Then, in the quiet between them, voices, 2 of them. Arguing by the rhythm of it, though she couldn't make out the words. 30 meters ahead, in the tree cluster, she touched Dawson's arm and pointed. Held up 2 fingers. He nodded. She made a splitting motion she would go left, wide around the tree cluster, come at the position from the south. She pointed at him, then at the ground, then made a slow forward motion. He moved straight in, slowly, staying in the trees, maintaining pressure on their front while she came around the flank. He shook his head once. A short, controlled motion. She looked at him. "You're not going to circle a prepared position with a compromised shoulder and 50 rounds of ammunition alone," he said. The quietness of his voice was not softness. It was the flatness of a decision already made. "We move together. You take left of the cluster. I take right. We announce." "We don't announce," she said. 2 fighters in a defensive position in a storm. They have to be cold and scared and running low on everything, same as us. If we announce, there's a chance this ends without anyone else getting shot today. He paused. "I've been in the field for 11 years. I've given people the option to surrender more times than I can count. Sometimes they take it." She stared at him. In 6 years of this work, in every situation she'd been trained for, and every scenario she'd run in her mind, the option of announcing had never appeared as a variable. Her work was invisible. Announcement was the opposite of invisible. But announcement was also faster, and faster mattered right now because the storm was breaking, and QRF needed a clearance signal, and Bravo 3 needed surgery, and the math was what the math was. If they don't take it, she said, you go right immediately. Don't stay in the open. Understood, on my signal. They split at the tree cluster's northern edge, she going left, he going right, and she counted to 20 while she moved through the birch stand to get into her position on the southern flank. She could see the cluster from the south now. The two fighters were visible at 30 meters, pressed back against a dense stand of birch trunks, weapons and up, oriented generally north. The storm had kept them contained, focused on survival, and they'd let their situational awareness compress to the immediate area around them. Neither of them was scanning south. She had a shot. Clean, direct, manageable range. 30 meters, left side coverage, her carbine capable of this, even with the shoulder issue. She had the shot, and she could end this quietly and efficiently in the next 3 seconds. She thought about what Dawson had said. She kept her weapon up and keyed her radio once the signal she'd told Dawson to listen for. Dawson's voice cut through the wind from the north side of the cluster. Controlled, in the language she'd identified earlier from the fighter's communications. She didn't know what he was saying. She hadn't known. He spoke it, but the tone was unmistakable. The particular combination of authority and restraint that meant, put your weapons down, and this ends now. Both fighters spun toward his voice. Her carbine was already on the nearer one. Don't, she said. Both fighters froze. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds and felt much longer. She could see the calculation happening in real time, the two men processing the geometry, understanding that there was a voice from the north and a weapon from the south, and there was no angle where the math worked in their favor. The nearer one lowered his weapon first, slowly, deliberately, the barrel going toward the ground. He said something. One of the 2 or 3 words that sound the same in most languages. A word that meant done. The second man looked at the first, at his weapon on the ground, at something he couldn't see in the white to the north. He lowered his weapon. She was on them. In 6 seconds, weapons cleared, both men zip-tied with the flex cuffs from her kit, positioned back-to-back against the birch trunks. Dawson covered from the north while she worked, and when it was done, he came around the cluster and looked at the 2 secured men and then at her. You had the shot, he said. Yes. You waited anyway. You were right, she said. It cost her something to say it, not because she was proud, but because admitting it out loud made it real, and real things had weight. It's faster this way. He studied her for a moment. Then he pointed at the larger of the 2 prisoners. He has a radio. We should see if anyone else is checking in. She hadn't thought of that. She pulled the radio from the man's kit, older model, military surplus, and checked the frequency. Active. She listened for 30 seconds. Nothing incoming. Either there were no other elements, or the storm had killed their communication as it had intermittently killed hers. She keyed her own radio. 0 Guardian. Eastern Ridge clear. 2 prisoners secured. No additional active elements confirmed. Clear for QRF launch over. Guardian 0. Copy all. QRF launching now. Estimated time on station 55 minutes. Over. She looked at the 2 prisoners. Then at Dawson. We need to get them back to the cave. QRF will want them. Can you... He looked at her shoulder, the injury she'd been managing for the past 3 hours. I can manage. She bent and grabbed the nearer prisoner by the collar and pulled him to his feet. The man winced, cold, stiff joints, same as everyone out here. She found she couldn't summon much sympathy. She pointed north. He understood. The movement back to the cave took 22 minutes. The 2 prisoners moved under direction without resistance, which she found she appreciated. She'd had enough resistance for one day. When she pushed the first prisoner through the cave entrance, Bravo came off the wall with his weapon up before she'd cleared the opening. He took in the situation prisoners, zip-tied Dawson behind them and lowered the weapon and said something under his breath that she didn't catch. Bravo 4 was awake, kneeling beside Bravo 3, who had his eyes open and was tracking the room with the careful attention of someone fighting the fog of blood loss and staying angry about it. Bravo 3 looked at the two prisoners, then at Evelyn. He said slowly and with significant effort, "Did you clear the whole ridge by yourself?" "No," she said. "Your team lead helped at the end." Bravo 3 looked at Dawson. Dawson said nothing. "He's being modest," Bravo 3 said, and then he closed his eyes. And from his expression, she thought he might have been doing something that approximated a smile. She sat down against the cave wall and put her carbine across her knees and looked at the entrance. The light coming through it was different than it had been when they left lighter. The flat gray of full storm replaced by the brighter gray of breaking weather, the kind of light that meant the cloud layer was thinning. QRF in 55 minutes. The shoulder was genuinely bad now. Not moving anymore bad, not dropping the weapon bad, but bad enough that the adrenaline no longer covered it and the cold no longer numbed it, and it presented itself with every heartbeat as a specific, located, insistent fact. She pressed her back against the rock and breathed through it. Dawson sat down beside her. Not close, the appropriate distance. "You speak their language," she said. "Some. Grew up with a neighbor who spoke it. Picked up enough to be dangerous." A pause. Seemed like the right moment to use it. She thought about that. The moment he'd calculated that there was a chance that announcing was faster, that the math might work. She thought about how wrong he could have been and how the situation could have resolved differently and how it hadn't. "Good call," she said. He glanced at her. The expression on his face, she'd been reading his face for 4 days through a scope, and 2 days in close proximity, was one she hadn't seen before. Quieter than his usual assessment look. More personal. "Who trained you?" he asked. "Program that doesn't exist." "Obviously. But someone taught you how to do what you did on that ridge." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm was genuinely breaking now. She could hear the wind losing its authority, the sustained howl dropping to something intermittent. Light continued to improve at the cave entrance. "A lot of people trained me," she said finally. "Most of them would tell you they failed." "Why?" "Because the program's doctrine says you maintain distance. You stay invisible. You do not close to direct action range." "But you did." "Yes. And the people who trained you, you think they'd call that failure." She considered the question with the same precision she'd brought to firing solutions, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a problem with variables, and a correct answer that existed whether she found it or not. The people who had trained her were good people doing a necessary job within a doctrine built on sound principles. Distance was protection. Invisibility was the mission. They weren't wrong. "I think," she said slowly, "they'd say the doctrine failed." "Not me." Dawson nodded once, the small, considered nod of someone filing something away. "Bravo 3, he said. "His name is Marcus Webb. He has a daughter. Turned 2 last month." He paused. "I'm telling you that because I think you should know who you went off the Ridgeline for." She didn't respond immediately. The information landed in a place she hadn't prepared for it, not in her professional assessment, not in her tactical calculation. But somewhere further in, somewhere that the 6 years of distance and invisibility and mathematical killing had not fully insulated. Marcus Webb, 2-year-old daughter. "I don't usually know their names," she said. "I know. The program works better if I don't. I know that too." He paused. "But you already broke the protocol when you came off the ridge. Might as well know what you came off the ridge for." She looked at Bravo 3, Marcus Webb, lying on the emergency blanket, with his eyes and his breathing steady and his tourniquet doing exactly what it was supposed to do, keeping him in the world for his daughter. She looked away. Outside, the light at the cave entrance shifted again, and then faintly, impossibly welcome, through the diminishing storm, the distant rhythmic percussion of rotary blades. Not close yet. far enough that it was more feeling than sound, transmitted through the rock and the air and the thinning cloud. But real. Bravo 4 heard it at the same moment she did. He looked up from Marcus Webb's vitals, and for the first time since she'd found this team in the frozen valley, something on his face that wasn't clinical came through. Some things that looked like relief, trying to find a way out of a face that had been keeping it contained for a very long time. "They're coming," he said, not to anyone specific, just to the cave. Evelyn stood. Her shoulder protested the motion, and she let it. She walked to the cave entrance and looked out at the valley, at the clearing sky above it, at the thin blade of winter light that was cutting through the breaking cloud layer for the first time in hours. She could see the valley floor again, the frozen ground, the scattered debris of the earlier firefight, the twin ridgeline standing above it all in silence. She reached for her radio, and that was when Zero came through with something that wasn't the QRF update she was expecting. "Guardian, Zero. Be advised Colonel Hartman is on site at FOB Kessel and is requesting real-time status on your mission deviation. He is specifically asking about the nature and extent of your protocol breach. Over." She stood in the cave entrance with the winter light on her face and the sound of helicopters somewhere in the distance and the weight of what was coming settling through her with the same clarity she brought to everything else. She'd known it was coming. She'd known it from the moment she'd told Zero she was going in. Command didn't send assets into a program like hers without attaching expectations, and the central expectation was invisibility. She'd been visible. She'd been extremely, undeniably, documentably visible. She keyed the radio. "Tell Colonel Hartman I'll debrief on arrival," she said. "And tell him Bravo Element is secure and coming home. All of them." She paused. Guardian out. She clipped the radio and looked at the valley. The helicopters were louder now. The clashing, real, specific, and close enough to see. Two black shapes dropping through the breaking cloud layer toward the valley floor. Rotors hammering the cold air into something warmer. Behind her, inside the cave, she heard Bravo 4 tell Marcus Webb the birds were inbound. Heard Webb say something back in a voice that was rough and thin, but was still a voice, still a man's voice, still a father's voice. She stood in the entrance and watched the helicopters come down. The cold pressed against her from every direction, the same cold that had been pressing for 4 days, patient and indifferent and absolute. She pressed back, the way she always had, the way she always would. It was the only thing she knew how to do with things that didn't relent. The helicopters came down hard and fast, the way military pilots landed in marginal weather committed. No hovering, no hesitation. The rotors hammering the valley floor into a temporary blizzard of displaced snow that whited out everything within 30 meters of the touchdown point. Two Black Hawks, side by side, crew chiefs already out before the skilled fully says, moving toward the cave entrance with the practiced urgency of people who'd done enough times that urgency had become their resting state. Evelyn stepped aside. The extraction was efficient and impersonal in the way that military medicine was always efficient and impersonal. Bravo 3 loaded first, the flight medic taking the handoff from Bravo 4 with a 30-second verbal exchange that covered tourniquet, time, estimated blood loss, and core temperature. The information passed like a baton in a relay, where dropping it was not an option. The two prisoners were zip-tied to the deck of the second aircraft. Bravo 2 and Bravo 4 loaded without ceremony. Dawson was last. He stopped at the cave entrance and looked at her. "You're not on my bird," he said. "No." He looked at the second helicopter. "You're on that one." "No," she paused. "I have my own extraction." He studied her for a moment. In the flat winter light, the rotors hammering the air above them, making conversation something you had to lean into. "Will I see you again?" "Probably not." Something crossed his face, not surprise, exactly. More like the specific expression of someone accepting a fact they'd already suspected but hadn't wanted confirmed. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm without being demonstrative, the handshake of someone who understood that the gesture was doing work that words weren't adequate for. Marcus Webb's daughter, he said. Her name is Lily. Evelyn said nothing. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned and walked to the helicopter and climbed in. And the crew chief pulled the door, and the two Black Hawks lifted off the valley floor in a wash of rotor noise and displaced snow, and were gone into the breaking sky in under 40 seconds. The valley went quiet. She stood in the cave entrance for a moment and listened to the silence that followed the helicopters, the particular deep quiet of a wilderness that had just finished absorbing a significant amount of violence and was returning to its default state. Wind, birch branches, the distant settling of snow. She keyed her radio. 0 Guardian. Bravo element successfully extracted. I am at cave position, awaiting my pickup. Over, Guardian, 0. Your extraction is 40 minutes out. And Guardian, a pause that meant something was being chosen carefully on the other end. Colonel Hartman will be on your bird. He wants the debrief airborne. Over. She looked at the empty valley. Copy, she said. She used the 40 minutes to do the things that needed doing, clearing the cave of any equipment signature, consolidating her kit, conducting the kind of field self-assessment she'd been putting off since the fragment strike. She peeled back her outer layer and looked at her shoulder in the cave's dim light. The fragment had opened a gash 3 inches long across the posterior deltoid and driven something rock, she thought, based on the texture of what she could feel into the muscle tissue below it. Not deep enough to have hit anything structural. Deep enough that it hurt with a persistence that was going to be a problem in the cold. She packed it with what she had in her kit and taped it with the precision of someone who'd been taught to treat their own wounds in the field because the alternative was going untreated. It wasn't elegant. It would hold. The third helicopter arrived exactly 38 minutes later. Smaller than the Black Hawk's a medium utility platform, 2 crew, and in the cabin, when the door opened, Colonel Richard Hartman, who was 54 years old, and ran the Guardian program from a building that appeared in no directory and received its funding through 3 layers of appropriations that officially didn't exist. He was a compact man, gray at the temples, the kind of gray that arrived from stress rather than age. He had the posture of someone who had spent decades carrying the weight of decisions that couldn't be explained to anyone in a very small room, and it had compressed him slightly, pushed his shoulders forward, given him the permanently calculating expression of a man for whom every conversation was a problem to be managed. He looked at her when she climbed in. His eyes went to the shoulder, first the bulk of the field, dressing under her outer layer, then to her face. He didn't say anything until the helicopter lifted off and the valley disappeared below them. Then he said, "You look terrible. I've been outside for 4 days." "I know how long you've been outside." He had a folder on his knee. She recognized her own mission log data in it, the burst transmissions she'd sent over 4 days, compiled and printed by someone in a warm room. "Sit down, Mercer." She sat. The helicopter was loud enough that the conversation was effectively private from the 2 crew members forward. Hartman didn't appear concerned about that. He opened the folder. "Walk me through the deviation." Bravo 3 took a round in the femoral region approximately 4 minutes before the team reached covered positions. Bravo 4 was pinned. The northern machine gun had the approach route zeroed. QRF was 48 minutes out. She kept her voice even and factual. The casualty would not have survived 48 minutes without the tourniquet. "So you broke Overwatch?" "Yes." "You closed to direct action range?" "Yes." "You engaged a force of how many total?" "I counted 20 at peak. I personally engaged 14. Hartman looked at her over the top of the folder. His expression was not readable in the simple way that anger or approval were readable. It was the expression of someone running a complex internal calculation that involved variables she wasn't fully aware of. 14, he said, over approximately 90 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the helicopter windows, the Finnish wilderness scrolled past below them, an endless white and gray expanse broken by the dark lines of frozen rivers and the irregular shadows of forest. Beautiful in the abstract way that things were beautiful when you were too tired to have a personal response to them. The program's doctrine exists for a reason, Hartman said. You understand that? Yes. Guardian assets are irreplaceable in the field. They are invisible because invisibility is their primary value. The moment you are seen, the moment you are known, the protection you provide to every other asset operating in your area is degraded. Not hypothetically, actually. He paused. You were seen by 20 fighters, 4 SEALs, and their command element. You transmitted identifying information, your call sign, your voice, your position on multiple frequencies. Your existence as an asset is now known to people who are not supposed to know it. Bravo element is not the concern. He closed the folder. The concern is that the program's value is predicated on its secrecy. One deviation becomes precedent. Precedent becomes doctrine. And the doctrine that got you here says, stay on the ridge. She looked at him. The doctrine that got me here says, protect American operators. Within parameters. The parameters didn't cover the situation. Parameters never cover every situation. That's why they're parameters and not case-by-case instructions. He leaned back slightly. Give me the argument you were making in your head when you decided to break protocol. Not the outcome. I know the outcome. The argument. She thought about how to answer that. Hartman wasn't asking for a justification. He was asking for the reasoning, which was different. He wanted to know how her mind had moved through the decision, because that told him something about whether the decision had been principled or impulsive. The doctrine protects the program by keeping Guardian assets invisible, she said. The program's purpose is to protect American operators. When those two objectives conflict directly, when maintaining invisibility means watching a man die who doesn't have to die, the doctrine is not serving its purpose. It's contradicting it. A pause. I made the call that the doctrine had failed the situation. Not that I was above the doctrine. Hartman was quiet. Outside, the landscape continued scrolling. That's a very clean argument, he said. It's the one I had. Did you consider that you might die on that ridge? That losing a Guardian asset in a direct action engagement with a compromised position and a confirmed enemy sniper was a realistic outcome? Yes. And Marcus Webb has a 2-year-old daughter. She said it flatly, without decoration. That was in the calculation. Something shifted in Hartman's face. Not softened. Hartman didn't soften. She'd worked under him for 3 years, and she'd never seen him soften. But something reconfigured. A small movement behind the eyes that suggested the internal calculation had reached a new variable it hadn't anticipated. Webb, he said. The team lead told me his name at the cave. And about his daughter. Dawson told you. Yes. Dawson is not supposed to know Guardian assets well enough to be telling them about his team members' families. No, she said, he's not. Another silence. Hartman picked up the folder and set it down again without opening it. Outside the window, the landscape was changing, the wilderness giving way at the margins to the first indications of infrastructure. A road cutting through the forest below, then a cluster of buildings near a frozen lake. You're going to need surgery on that shoulder, he said. I know, and a psych eval. Standard after any direct action engagement, doubly so for an asset whose mission profile doesn't include direct action. I know, and after that, he looked at her directly. I have a problem that your situation has put me in. Formally speaking, you violated your mission parameters significantly enough that a review board is not just possible, but required. The program's oversight committee will want to examine what happened and what it means going forward. That process will take time, and it will be uncomfortable, and it will involve people asking you the same questions I'm asking you now, less charitably. I understand, do you? It wasn't a question, because what I want you to understand is that the review board is not the outcome I'm concerned about. The outcome I'm concerned about is what happens to the program if what you did on that ridge becomes the new expectation. He paused. Guardian assets are not infantry. They are not close-quarters specialists. They are precision overwatch, and the precision is the point, not just the shooting, the entire architecture of distance and invisibility and patience. You are good at your job because you understand that architecture. If the program loses that understanding, it loses its value. I understand that. Then help me understand what you would have done differently. She sat with the question, not deflecting from it, not reaching for the easy answer. Actually sitting with it, the way she sat with difficult firing solutions, letting the variables present themselves, and without forcing a conclusion. Nothing, she said finally. Hartman looked at her. I would do it exactly the same, she said. I would call the deviation. I would close the range. I would clear the positions. Because the outcome was the right outcome, and the reasoning was sound, and the doctrine failed the situation, not the other way around. She held his gaze. If that means a review board, I'll sit in front of it and make the same argument I just made to you. The program's purpose is to bring operators home. I brought them home. If the program wants to punish me for doing its purpose too thoroughly, that's a conversation worth having out loud. The helicopter began its descent. Through the forward windows, she could see the FOBB below a cluster of prefab structures inside a perimeter, the Finnish military installation that was hosting the forward command element. The flags at the gate reduced to flat panels by the wind that still ran hard at ground level, even as the storm's main body moved east. Hartman was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read for a long moment. Then he picked up the folder and tucked it under his arm. When I built this program, he said, I recruited 12 people. You were the youngest. You were also the one that 3 of the 5 selection board members voted against. Because your psychological profile showed a tendency toward independent decision-making that they felt was inconsistent with a mission requiring strict discipline. He paused. I overruled them. She didn't respond. I told them that independent decision-making, properly channeled, was the difference between an asset who followed doctrine into a failed situation and an asset who solved problems the doctrine hadn't anticipated. Another pause. I want you to know I'm not regretting that decision. I want you to also know that what happened on that ridge is going to require me to have a series of very difficult conversations with people who have authority over this program's funding and oversight, and those conversations are going to be easier or harder, depending on how you conduct yourself in the review. I'll cooperate fully. I know you will. He stood as the helicopter settled onto the landing pad, the skids touching down with a slight lurch. Mercer. She looked at him. Webb's daughter, he said. Lily. Yes. Get your shoulder looked at. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the rotor wash. Without another word, the folder tucked under his arm, already moving toward the prefab command building, with the compressed, forward-leaning walk of a man who had arrived somewhere and immediately had somewhere else to be. She climbed out after him and stood on the landing pad while the helicopter powered down around her. The wind hit her immediately cold, direct, the kind of wind that found the injury in her shoulder and made a note of it. She stood still for a moment and looked at the FOB, the fencing, the prefabs, the Finnish pine forest pressing against the perimeter on 3 sides. She'd been in the field for 4 days and in combat for most of one of them, and she was standing on a concrete landing pad in a Finnish military installation, and a colonel she'd worked for 3 years had just told her, in the most Hartman way possible, that she'd done the right thing and was going to be held accountable for it anyway. That was, she thought, about as accurate a summary of her professional life as anyone had ever offered. The medical facility was a prefab unit in the FOB's northwest corner, identifiable by the red cross on the door and the generator noise from behind it. She started walking toward it. She was 20 meters from the door when she heard her name. Not her call sign, her name. Mercer. She turned. Dawson was standing at the edge of the landing pad. He was in dry clothes now. Someone had gotten him a change of kit, and his face had color in it that hadn't been there in the cave. He looked like a man who had been debriefed and cleaned up and fed and was still running on something that wasn't quite relief. She hadn't expected to see him again. She'd said as much when they extracted. "You said, probably not," he said, apparently reading her expression. "You didn't say definitely. How did you know I was landing here?" "Command told us the Guardian asset was coming to this OB for medical." He paused. "I asked them to tell me when you landed." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the look, the same one he'd had in the cave when he was running an argument in his head and determining whether to voice it. "Marcus is out of surgery. Flew him to the hospital at Rovaniemi. They repaired the vessel. He's going to keep the leg." She absorbed that. "His wife is flying in tomorrow," Dawson continued. "And I know you're going to say it's not your—" He stopped. "Tried again. I told him about you. Not your name, not your unit. Just that there was someone on Overwatch who came off the ridge when she didn't have to you. He wanted me to stop. Dawson," she was learning, was a man who spoke precisely and occasionally found precision insufficient. He said thank you. Those were his words. He said it twice. The wind moved across the landing pad between them. "Tell him," she stopped herself. In 6 years, she had never had a conversation like this one. There was no protocol for it. There was no language she'd been given. "Tell him Lily's lucky," she said finally, "to have him come home." Dawson nodded once. She turned back toward the medical facility. "Mercer," his voice again. She stopped, but didn't turn. "The review board. I heard Hartman mention it when he was walking to the command building. If you need a statement from Bravo Element about what happened on that ridge. The review board can read my mission log. A mission log doesn't tell them what it looked like from the valley floor." A pause. "It doesn't tell them what it meant to 4 people watching someone clear a ridgeline to come down to them. That's testimony. I'll give it." She stood with her back to him and looked at the medical facility door and felt the wind working at the gap between her collar and her balaclava. The injury in her shoulder was presenting itself with increasing specificity now that the adrenaline was fully gone and the cold had nothing more to offer as a numbing agent. "That's not necessary," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." "I'm offering anyway." She turned enough to look at him over her shoulder. He was standing straight in the wind, hands at his sides, looking at her with the same direct assessment he'd been using since she materialized out of the storm in that valley. Not performing anything, not managing the moment, just standing in it. "I'll let you know," she said. It wasn't yes. It wasn't no. It was the most honest thing she had. He accepted it with a nod, and she turned back to the medical facility and pushed through the door into the warmth. And the Finnish military doctor inside looked up from her desk with an expression that said she'd seen enough field injuries to know not to ask how it happened until after she'd determined what needed to be done about it. "Sit down," the doctor said. Evelyn sat. The doctor peeled back the field dressing and looked at the shoulder for a long, clinical moment. Then she looked at Evelyn's face with the particular expression of a medical professional who was calculating pain tolerance and finding the number higher than expected. "This is going to need imaging," she said, "and probably extraction of the fragment under local. You're going to be here for a few hours." "That's fine. Are you in pain?" Evelyn thought about the question with the same precision she brought to everything else. The shoulder was in pain. The rest of her was in the particular exhausted numbness of a body that had spent everything it had and was currently running on reserves that themselves were running low. Her mind was still moving. It was always still moving. That was its nature. But the edge of it was softer than usual, less precise. The way a fine instrument went slightly out of calibration when it had been used beyond its rated conditions. "Yes," she said, because it was true, and because lying about it served nothing, and because the room was empty except for a Finnish doctor, who was about to look at her injury and would form her own conclusion regardless. On a scale of 1 to 10, she thought about that ridgeline, about the cold, About 11 hours in a ghillie suit and 90 minutes of close combat, and a mile through a whiteout carrying part of a man's body weight. 6, she said. The doctor looked at her with an expression that suggested she believed the number was wrong in a specific direction. I'll get you something for it after. Do the imaging first. The doctor held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and picked up the referral form and started writing. You military people, she said, not unkindly, are all the same. Evelyn said nothing. She sat on the examination table and looked at the wall, and listened to the wind outside the prefab walls, and thought about review boards and mission logs, and a 2-year-old girl named Lily, who was going to have her father at her next birthday. The doctor came back with the imaging referral, and a look that said the next few hours were going to be uncomfortable, and there was nothing either of them could do about that. Evelyn stood up and followed her. She had been through uncomfortable before. She knew the way. The fragment came out under local anesthetic at 1,847 hours, a piece of granite roughly the size of a thumbnail that the Finnish doctor extracted with forceps and held up to the light for a moment before dropping it into a steel tray with a sound that was somehow smaller than it. Deserved to be, given what it had cost to earn it. Clean margins, the doctor said. The muscle tissue will repair. You'll have reduced range of motion for 4 to 6 weeks, and you'll need physiotherapy after that. She began closing the wound with the efficient, slightly impersonal stitching of someone who'd done this enough times that it had become craft rather than art. No field work for minimum 8 weeks. That's my recommendation. I'll pass it along. The doctor looked at her over the top of the wound. To whom? The people who make that decision. The doctor made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite disapproval and went back to her stitching. Evelyn sat still on the table and looked at the wall and felt the local anesthetic doing its job, the shoulder numb in a way that was different from the cold numbness of the field clinical, temporary, borrowed comfort that she knew would end on a schedule that didn't care about her preference. She was out of the medical facility by 2,100 hours, arm in a slings she was already planning to remove when nobody was watching, carrying the granite fragment in the front pocket of her kit because the doctor had offered it, and she hadn't been able to articulate a reason to leave it behind. The FOB at night was a different environment than the OB at landing, quieter. The operational tempo dropped to its nocturnal rhythm. The generator noise and the wind and the distant sound of a Finnish patrol moving along the perimeter fence, the only things marking the hours. She'd been assigned a bunk in the transient quarters, a narrow room with 4 cots and a space heater that worked intermittently, and she sat on the edge of her cot and ran through the process of actually stopping the deliberate unwinding of the operational focus that had been running continuously for 4 days, and very long additional stretch that she was still in the process of cataloging. Her shoulder ached through the anesthetic's edge. Her legs were the specific heavy tiredness of muscles that had been used past their design parameters. She was hungry in a deep, structural way that a single meal in the FOB cafeteria had not addressed. She sat with all of it and didn't fight any of it, and eventually lay back on the cot and looked at the prefab ceiling and slept. She dreamed about her father. This happened sometimes after extended field work. The same way, old injuries sometimes presented themselves in cold weather, the body surfacing things that the waking mind kept organized. Her father's name had been Thomas Mercer, and he had been a civilian contractor, working security logistic in a region she still couldn't name even in memory, without the classification instinct firing. And he had been killed by a sniper her family had never seen coming, in a country her mother had never been able to visit, in circumstances that were explained to them in a 15-minute meeting with 2 men in suits who used the word unfortunate 3 times and answered none of the questions her mother asked. She had been 19. In the dream, he was at the kitchen table at their house in Virginia, the one with the yellow wallpaper that her mother had always hated and never changed. And he was drinking coffee and reading something, and she was standing in the doorway watching him, and the specific quality of the light in the dream was the light early morning. The kind that came through east-facing windows before the day had fully committed to itself. He didn't look up, but he said her name, just her name, the way he'd always said it, not calling her, not asking anything, just acknowledging that she was there, and he knew it, and that was sufficient. She woke at 400 to the sound of her radio. Guardian 0. Review board convenes at 900 at Phoebe Kessel Command Facility. Colonel Hartman requests your presence at 830 for pre-board briefing. Over. She sat up. Her shoulder reminded her of its opinion about the movement. She noted the opinion and stood anyway. Guardian copies. Out. She dressed in the dark, one-armed, the sling left on the cot, and went out into the FOB's cold pre-dawn to find coffee and whatever else the night cycle had left in the cafeteria. The pre-board briefing with Hartman was in a room that was too small for the table in it, a planning cell with maps on one wall and a whiteboard on another, and 2 chairs that didn't match each other or the table. Hartman was already there when she arrived, a cup of coffee at his elbow, the folder from the helicopter now considerably thicker, with additional materials she hadn't seen before. He looked at her sling. Sit down. She sat. The board is 3 people, he said. Brigadier General Cass, who oversees special operations programs in this theater. Deputy Director Fenn from the Oversight Office, civilian, no operational background, appointed specifically to provide independent review of programs like ours. And Colonel Yates from JSOC, who you've never met but who has opinions about Guardian program integration that he's been wanting to express formally for about 2 years. He paused. Yates is the problem. What's his position? His position is that Guardian assets operating in JSOC theaters without JSOC knowledge creates a command and control problem, and that your actions on that ridgeline are evidence of exactly the kind of uncontrolled, independent operation that validates his concern. Hartman picked up his coffee and set it down without drinking from it. He's not entirely wrong. That's what makes him the problem. What does he want? Program integration. Guardian assets folded into JSOC command structure, mission parameters set by theater commanders rather than program authority. He looked at her, which would effectively end the program as it exists. You cannot have invisible overwatch if the theater commander knows you're there. But the entire architecture collapses. She understood the argument. She'd been inside the architecture for 6 years. What does the board have authority to do? Recommend program suspension pending full review. Recommend asset reassignment. Recommend formal censure. He paused. Or recommend nothing and let the program continue. What are you expecting? I'm expecting Yates to make the argument he's been building toward for 2 years with your mission log as Exhibit A. Hartman looked at her directly. And I'm expecting you to answer his questions honestly, because dishonest answers in that room will end the program faster than anything Yates can argue. I always answer honestly. I know. That's why I'm telling you to do it, not asking you. He opened the folder and slid a single sheet across the table. Dawson submitted a voluntary statement at 2,300 last night. All 4 Bravo element members co-signed it. She looked at the sheet. It was a formal witness statement, JSOC letterhead, Dawson's name at the top as primary author, with Webb, Bravo 20, and Bravo 4 as co-signatories below. She read it once, then again. It was precise and factual and detailed, and it said, in the careful language of operators who understood how institutional documents worked, that Guardian Overwatch had provided 4 days of continuous protection, had identified an ambush force that theater intelligence had missed entirely, had attempted to address the situation within mission parameters before those parameters became incompatible with the survival of a critically wounded team member, and had subsequently conducted a solo direct action engagement against a force of 20 that had, in the assessment of 4 experienced SEAL operators, demonstrated a level of tactical competence they had collectively not encountered before. The last paragraph was Dawson's alone. It said, the question before this board is not whether Guardian Mercer violated her mission parameters. She did, and she has acknowledged this. The question is whether the mission parameters served the mission's purpose in this situation. In our assessment, they did not. Guardian Mercer's judgment corrected a failure of doctrine in real time, at significant personal risk, with complete success. We are alive because she made that correction. Any review that fails to account for that fact is a review of the paperwork, not the operation. She set the statement down on the table. He didn't have to do this, she said. No. It's going to complicate his relationship with JSOC Command. Probably. She looked at Hartman. Did you ask him to? No. Hartman picked up his coffee again and, this time, drank from it. He asked me how to submit it. She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up the statement and slid it back across the table. The board convened at 900 in the command facility's largest room, which was still not large enough to feel like anything other than a confrontation. Brigadier General Cass sat at the head of the table, a tall woman in her mid-50s, with the particular stillness of senior officers who had learned that the person who moved least in a room often controlled it. Deputy Director Fenn was to her right, Speaksel, a civilian in his 60s, with the careful neutrality of someone whose job required him to have no visible opinions until the moment they were required. Colonel Yates was to her left, and he was exactly what Hartman had described: a man with a thesis and the institutional momentum to push it. Evelyn sat across from all three of them. Hartman was behind her, off to the left, present but not at the table. She understood the positioning. This was her debrief. His job was to let her run it. Cass opened. Staff Sergeant Mercer. This board is convened to review the events of the operation in Northern Karelia, specifically the deviation from sanctioned mission parameters that occurred on Day 4. You've been briefed on the process. Do you have any questions before we begin? No, ma'am. Then let's start from the beginning. She walked them through it, methodically, chronologically, without editorializing. The 4-day overwatch, the identification of the ambush force, the warning to Bravo element, the opening engagement from distance, Bravo 3's wound and the machine gun that prevented treatment, the QRF timeline, the decision. Fenn asked clarifying questions throughout precise detailed, the questions of someone building a complete picture rather than making an argument. She answered each one fully. Yates waited until she'd finished before he spoke. He had a particular style patient on the surface, the patience of someone who had been saving something. Staff Sergeant Mercer. When you transmitted your intention to break Overwatch and enter direct action range, you received a response from 0, indicating that this was outside your sanctioned parameters. Yes. And you proceeded anyway. Yes. Without authorization. Yes. He paused, letting the 3 affirmatives sit in the room. Can you tell this board how a program that allows its assets to self-authorize departures from mission parameters is functionally different from a program with no parameters at all? It was a good question. She'd known it was coming because it was the obvious question, the load-bearing argument in everything Yates had been building. And she'd spent part of the previous night sitting with it honestly rather than just preparing a defense against it. The program has parameters, she said. I violated them. Those are both true. The question of whether the violation was correct is separate from the question of whether the program has parameters. She looked at him directly. A surgeon who deviates from standard procedure because the patient's anatomy presents an unanticipated complication is not evidence that surgical standards are meaningless. It's evidence that standards exist to serve outcomes, not the other way around. That analogy assumes the deviation produced a better outcome than adherence would have. 4 people came home. One of them will keep his leg. The alternative outcome, given the QRF timeline and the casualty status, was not 4 people coming home. You can't know that with certainty. No, she said. I can't. I made a probability assessment in the field with the information available to me. That's what field judgment is. She paused. If you're asking me whether I was certain, I wasn't. If you're asking me whether the assessment was reasonable given the information I had, I believe it was. Yates shifted in his chair. The SEAL team's statement characterizes your performance on that ridgeline as exceptional. 4 operators with combined experience of over 40 years using the word exceptional is not a term they apply lightly. He paused. I want to understand how a program that, by design, produces assets operating entirely alone and entirely invisibly produces someone capable of what you did. Because what the mission log describes is not Overwatch. It's something else. The room was quiet. She thought about how to answer that. Not about the diplomatic version or the institutional version, but about the true version, which was the only one she was willing to give in this room. My father was killed by a sniper, she said. Civilian contractor. He never saw it coming. My family was told about it by 2 men in suits who used the word unfortunate and didn't answer my mother's questions. She watched Yates's face carefully. I joined this program because I understood, at a very basic level, what it meant to have someone watching and what it meant to not have someone watching. She paused. I am good at this job because I cannot be indifferent to what happens to the people I'm protecting. The distance is physical. The investment is not. The room held the statement. Cass spoke first. Staff Sergeant Mercer, step outside for 10 minutes. She stood, moved to the door, paused. One more thing, she said, not turning fully around. The ambush in that valley was deliberate and pre-planned. Someone knew Bravo's route. That's an intelligence failure at a level above my mission. I'd recommend that question gets as much attention as my protocol deviation. She paused. That's all. She stepped out into the hallway and stood against the wall and looked at the opposite wall and waited. The 10 minutes became 22. When the door opened, it was Hartman who came through it, not one of the board members, and she read his face in the first second before he'd composed whatever expression he intended to present. Cass is recommending no formal censure, he said. Fenn concurs. The deviation is logged as a mission anomaly for program record, not a disciplinary action. A pause. Yates abstained. She absorbed that. Abstained. He said, and I'm quoting directly, that he was not prepared to recommend censure of someone whose judgment saved 4 lives, but that he maintained his position on integration and would be raising it through separate channels. Hartman paused, which means the integration argument is still alive. But it's not today's problem. The intelligence failure? Cass flagged it. It's being referred to Theater Intel Command for separate review. He looked at her steadily. You're cleared to return to program status after medical clearance. 8 weeks minimum, per the doctor's recommendation, which I am enforcing. She nodded.
Mercer.
He stopped. Something in his posture changed a small shift, the contained motion of a man allowing himself to say something he'd been composing carefully. What you did on that ridge is going to be the thing this program is defined by for a long time. Not because it was a deviation, because it was the clearest demonstration of what this program can be when it works correctly. He paused. I've been running Guardian for 9 years. I've sent assets into the field more times than I want to count. And I've gotten reports back, and I've managed the outcomes. I have never read a mission log that looked like yours from that operation. Another pause. I want you to know that. She looked at him. Hartman, who didn't soften, who ran the program from a building that didn't appear in any directory, who had overruled 3 board members to bring her in 9 years ago. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, briskly, and went back through the door. She stood in the hallway alone for a moment. Then she walked to the end of it and out the external door into the OB's cold morning air, and she stood on the steps and breathed it in the Finnish winter air, clean and cold and indifferent. The same air she'd been breathing for 4 days on that ridgeline, tasting the same way it had always tasted out here. Dawson was waiting at the bottom of the steps. She stopped. He was in full kit, a bag at his feet, clearly staged for transport. The Black Hawk on the landing pad behind him was spinning up, the rotors beginning their slow build toward operational speed. He was going somewhere. She was going somewhere. This was the actual goodbye, the one the helicopter extraction hadn't quite been, because she'd said probably not, and he'd taken that as a door left open. Bored, he said. Cleared. Mission anomaly, no censure. Something released in his face. Small. He covered it quickly, but she'd seen it. Good. Your statement helped. It was accurate. It was more than accurate. It was a risk for you. He shrugged one shoulder. Economical. It was the right thing to say. I'm not in the habit of not saying the right thing because it's inconvenient. He picked up his bag. The helicopter was getting louder behind him. Marcus is awake. They're allowing visitors tomorrow. His wife is already there. I know. She'd gotten the update through the FOB's medical liaison that morning. Tell him she stopped. Found the words. Tell him I'm glad the leg is staying. Dawson looked at her. You should tell him yourself. That's not how this works. I know how it works. He paused. I'm suggesting it could work differently. Just once. She looked past him at the helicopter, at the finished pine forest beyond the perimeter fence, at the gray-white sky above it all, the storm fully gone now, the kind of cold, clear winter sky that went on forever in every direction and contained, at this moment, nothing threatening. I'll think about it, she said. It wasn't yes, but it wasn't probably not. He seemed to understand the difference. He nodded once the same nod she'd seen in the cave, the one that meant received and filed and trusted, and then he picked up his bag and walked to the helicopter and climbed in, and the crew chief pulled the door. She watched the helicopter lift off, nose dipping forward as it accelerated south, dwindling to a shape, and then a sound, and then nothing. She stood on the steps for another moment. Then she went inside to find out what happened next. What happened next was 6 weeks of enforced medical status at a facility she wasn't permitted to name, where the physiotherapist assigned to her shoulder had the specific professional patience of someone accustomed to treating people whose relationship to pain was not entirely healthy, and where she spent the hours she wasn't in therapy reading, running when the doctor allowed it, and sitting with the long decompression that fieldwork required and that she'd never been particularly good at. She thought about her father during the first week more than she had in years, not the dream version, not the yellow wallpaper and the morning coffee, but the actual man, the specific weight of his voice, the way he'd always asked her questions and then listened to the answers in full before responding, which had seemed ordinary when she was a child and seemed rarer every year since. She thought about the two men in suits and the word unfortunate and her mother's questions that didn't get answered, and she thought about the sightline that had killed him some distance she'd never been told, some angle she'd never been given, a firing sign solution that had arrived and completed itself before anyone who loved him knew it was in the air. She had spent 6 years making sure that calculation failed for other people. It hadn't felt like enough. It never felt like enough. But it was the thing she knew how to do, and she kept doing it, and people kept coming home, and that was the closest thing to sufficient that she'd found. In the 3rd week, she received a package. No return address. Finnish postmark. Inside was a photograph slightly out of focus, taken in what appeared to be a hospital room, a man she recognized as Marcus Webb sitting up in a hospital bed with a small dark-haired girl on his lap. The girl's face turned toward the camera with the completely unself-conscious delight of a 2-year-old who had been asked to smile and had done so with her entire body. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting she didn't recognize, Lily says hi. M.W. She put the photograph on the windowsill of her room where the morning light hit it. She looked at it every day for the remaining 3 weeks of her medical status, and she never fully resolved what she felt about it. It was too large for a single feeling, too specific for a general one. It was Marcus Webb alive. It was Lily with her father. It was the distance between what could have happened in that valley and what did, collapsed into a slightly out-of-focus photograph in a Finnish hospital room. It was why she did the job. On the day her medical clearance came through, Hartman called. I have something I want to discuss, he said. not a deployment. A different kind of conversation. She drove to the facility. Hartman's office was the same as always. No photographs, no personal items, the maps and the secured communications equipment, and the desk that held the weight of things that didn't appear in any official record. She sat across from him, and he sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was, she'd learned, Hartman's version of gathering himself. The review board's recommendation included a secondary note, he said. Cass wrote it. Fenn co-signed, even Yates, technically, by not objecting. He slid a document across the desk. Read it. She read it. The secondary note was 3 paragraphs. The first described the tactical situation in northern Karelia. The second described her response to it. The third recommended that the program examine whether its current doctrine distance, invisibility, separation was the only architecture capable of delivering Guardian's protective function, or whether there was a complementary model, assets trained to operate at both extremes, distance and close range, overwatch and direct action, the full spectrum of protective capability in a single operator. The note recommended that if such a model were developed, the program should consider who was best positioned to develop it. She set the document down. They want me to write a new doctrine, she said. They want me to consider it. I'm considering it by talking to you. He paused. What I'm actually asking is whether you want to build something. Not just be sent somewhere. Build it. She sat with the question for a long moment. In 6 years, she had been sent places and done the job and come back and been sent places again. The architecture of her life was distance, distance from the people she protected, distance from the results of her work, distance from the things she felt about all of it. Distance had been the job and the protection and the doctrine and the cost. What does building it look like? She said. Training. A cohort of candidates selected through the existing Guardian pipeline, put through an expanded program that includes everything you demonstrated on that ridge, in addition to everything you were already trained to do. It takes 2 years, maybe 3. You design the curriculum. You run the selection, you teach. He looked at her steadily. You'd be here, not in the field. You're grounding me. I'm offering you something more than the field. A pause. You can say no. The deployment option is also on the table. Your medical clearance is active, and there are 3 operations that would benefit from your overwatch capability. She looked at the document on the desk. She looked at the document, at the photograph she'd carried in her kit from Finland, currently in the front pocket of her jacket, next to the piece of granite. She thought about what it meant to watch from a distance, to be invisible, to do the job in the shadows and never be known, and to come back alone every time, and go out again alone every time, and for that to be, year after year, the whole shape of it. She thought about what it might mean to take someone through the beginning of that path, to give them the things she'd built slowly and painfully over 6 years, and a ridgeline in northern Karelia, to make them better faster than she'd been able to be, because someone was there to show them where the edges were. The candidates, she said. What's the selection pool? Something changed in Hartman's expression. Not quite a smile. Hartman didn't do quite smiles. But an adjacent movement. The expression of a man who had made a prediction and was watching it confirm. Existing Guardian pipeline, he said. We'd open a parallel track. You'd have final selection authority. I want field deployment available. Not regular, not on a schedule. But if there's a situation where my specific capability is the right tool, I want the option. Negotiable. I want the curriculum to include what I did on that ridge. Not as an exceptional case, as a designed capability. If someone comes through this program, they should be able to do what I did. That's the point of the program. She looked at him. Then yes. He nodded, picked up a pen, made a note on the pad beside the document. You start in 6 weeks. I'll need a preliminary curriculum outline in 4. I'll have it in 3. He looked up. Don't oversell yourself on the timeline. I'm not. She paused. I've been thinking about this for 6 years. I just didn't know that's what I was doing. She picked up the document and folded it once and put it in her jacket pocket, next to the photograph and the piece of granite. And she stood and looked at Hartman's desk and then at Hartman. The intelligence failure, she said. The compromised route. Has it been resolved? Still under investigation. I want to be briefed when it is. You're not going to be a field asset on that. I want to be briefed, she said again. Quiet. The flatness that closed subjects. Someone set up an ambush for that team. Someone knew where they were going. That's not finished business. Hartman looked at her for a moment. I'll make sure you're in the loop. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked out of the office and through the facility and into the parking lot where the late winter air hit her, with the same indifferent cold it always had, and she stood beside her car for a moment and looked at the sky. Clear. The specific pale blue of winter at its turning point where the worst of the season was past, but hadn't said so officially yet. The kind of sky that looked like a decision. She put her hand in her jacket pocket and felt the photograph and the granite against her fingers. Marcus Webb in a hospital bed with Lily in his lap. The piece of rock that had come out of her shoulder and gone into a steel tray and come back to her because she couldn't think of a reason to leave it. Both things true at the same time. The cost and the reason. The thing it took and the thing it was for. She got in her car. In 4 weeks, she would have a curriculum outline on Hartman's desk. In 6 weeks, she would stand in front of the first cohort of a program that didn't have a name yet, in a room that didn't appear on any floor plan, and she would look at the people in that room. She would begin the work of making sure that what she'd learned in 6 years of frozen ridgelines and impossible distances and a careful arithmetic of protection didn't die with the circumstances that had produced it. She would teach them how to watch, how to be patient, how to calculate the moment when watching was no longer enough and something else was required, how to make that transition without losing themselves as in it, how to carry the weight of knowing names and not knowing names and the specific space between those two things. She would teach them what the distance cost, and she would teach them that sometimes when the math demanded it, you set the distance aside. She drove. The road ahead was clear and cold and straight, running through the winter landscape toward something that wasn't yet fully defined, which was, she understood now, exactly how the best things began not with certainty, but with the willingness to move toward them anyway, through whatever the terrain required, at whatever the cost, without stopping until the job was done. Her name would remain classified. Her victories would stay hidden. The people she trained would go out into the world and stand on ridgelines that nobody knew about and protect people who didn't know they were being protected. And sometimes the doctrine would fail and they would have to make a call in the cold with a bad shoulder and 50 rounds and a timeline that didn't care about their survival. And they would be ready. Because someone who knew what that felt like had taken the time to prepare them. The greatest protection is invisible, but the heart behind it never is.